Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Larry Kaiser, and I am the Vice President of Marketing here at Optimum Healthcare IT. And we're happy to have you join us today for this installment of our webinar series. Today's presentation is entitled Virtual Healthcare IT Projects. And we're looking forward to today's presenter, who is Jeff Blanding. And Jeff is Optimum's Vice President of Implementation, managing enterprise EMR implementations, merger acquisition integration. He also is the manager of our managed services team. He has 6 years of implementation and product management experience at Epic, and very experienced, very knowledgeable in the space. So today's presentation is going to be about 30 minutes, and we've left some time at the end for Q&A. So if you do have a question during the session, please use the questions sidebar, and you can put your question in there, and we will make sure that question gets answered. Additionally, there is a handout of our implementation brochure in case you're interested in that. Great. So Jeff, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you. So hi, everyone. This is Jeff Blanding. I head up the implementation and managed services teams here at Optimum. And prior to Optimum, as Larry had mentioned, my background includes several years consulting on IT strategy and operations, a couple of years leading operations at a patient engagement startup, and then prior to that, working on implementation and a little bit on product at Epic in Wisconsin. And then also, as Larry had mentioned, so here at Optimum, our implementation work spans large projects, whether that's EMR implementations with a large majority of that being Epic, Community Connect or other community extension projects, and merger IT integrations, as well as smaller projects, so things like new facility rollouts, new clinic rollouts, specialty application implementations. And we've kind of had a unique perspective here on how to run projects in a virtual world, as we've had different projects at different points in the project lifecycle over the past 5 months here. So back in May, for example, we had an enterprise Epic go live, obviously pretty close to the beginning of the pandemic. So there were some, as you can imagine, last minute adjustments to get that go live, and then the support and the training and all those pieces that we'll touch on today in place at somewhat short notice as we entered the new normal that we've been in here now for the past few months. We also have several other projects that are either in flight and even have kicked off or are about to kick off in the virtual world. So we've really had some good exposure adapting to the challenges of the recent events and what that looks like at different stages of project maturity, and that's what we'll try to share with you today. We've also got that application managed services team, which is really a fully remote team, and they support client teams whom they have not necessarily met. In some cases they have, but in many cases they have not. So we've got them for some perspective as well as how you, in terms of how you manage IT support and IT projects in that type of environment. So how I'll structure the conversation today is simply by talking through the project lifecycle at a pretty high level, and trying to hit on a few lessons learned for each phase of a technology project. And additionally, I'll try to hit at least a little bit in each phase on people, spanning both your stakeholders and your IT team, on processes, and on your enabling technology that you can really use in this virtual world to be successful in your projects. I'll try to weave in some real life examples from some of those projects that I'd mentioned as I go along here. As Larry mentioned, we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to stay somewhat high level, but please do submit your questions, or if there's anything you'd like to dive in deeper through the chat function. And then don't hesitate to contact me or anyone else, your account rep, anyone at Optimum after the presentation, to keep the conversation going. Now, just to set the scene, I think there are a few key ways that working virtually, especially on complex healthcare technology projects, is more complicated than in person. And I'll highlight just a few of these and then try to touch on each of these as we go along, and some of the techniques and tools and tricks that we've used to try to mitigate some of the risk that comes along with this. So the first is that even if you're comfortable with working and managing others remotely, it's very possible that other managers on your team and then others in different business units at your organization are not. So you're going to be working with stakeholders in in clinical, in the business office, in the rev cycle office. Even if you have a fairly mature IT organization that has already embraced virtual work, likely some of those will not. And really, when working on an IT project like this, we have to make sure that we're accommodating those others who may be less comfortable. You might also have managers with different levels of comfort. Some managers are more comfortable and trusting that remote work is getting done and can do the right work to trust but verify, while others are not necessarily as comfortable. Next, I'll point out that some of what I'm going to talk about today is really not unique to a virtual project. It's kind of PMO 101 type stuff, but a lot of those basics become even more important when you're trying to keep all the trains running on time while you and your team and your stakeholders are working from home. So we'll talk a lot about putting the right structures and processes in place early and how that's going to help you run your project. And then third, engagement isn't easy in the best of times. And being remote is only going to exacerbate that, both for you and for your teams, and then for your stakeholders as well. So making sure your project is a priority and engages the right stakeholders is going to take a dedicated effort, and it requires a structure and a planned approach, more so, or even more so than it would in pace in the world. And we'll focus on those structures as well. And then finally, forming teams and working relationships is even more complicated in a virtual world when you lack that in-person daily interaction. So bringing together a brand new group of people from a variety of backgrounds and with variety of strengths and weaknesses and working habits and things like that, and then getting them to the point where we can work towards a shared goal is a challenge, and it takes a dedicated approach to form a cohesive, productive team. So those are some of the key points we're going to try to hit on here, as well as some others, but just to give you an idea of where we're going. So starting from the beginning, we'll dive into the project lifecycle, an imaginary project here, and talk through what it looks like as you build a team and kick off a new project in a virtual world. As I was just mentioning, I think building a new team virtually is one of the more challenging aspects of launching a virtual project. And this could be anything from a group of people who've known each other but not necessarily worked together to something like an epic team where you might have a essentially brand new team of 100 plus people who are coming from operations, who are coming from IT, who are coming from outside the organization. Depending on your project, you might have consultants in the mix, you might have vendors in the mix. So getting everyone comfortable with each other, getting everyone to trust each other, getting to the point where you can talk about difficult subjects and to learn each other's strengths and lean on each other the right way is a challenge. I think there are a couple of things you can do to make that easier. So first is really invest and help your team invest in building relationships. And that might mean taking a few minutes at the beginning of team meetings to get to know one another. It may mean giving your teams ad hoc calls now and then to check in how they're doing, both professionally and personally. But I think that the main takeaway is personal relationships do really matter as you're going through the hard work of a complicated project, and it pays to invest in that bank account now so that you can draw down from it in the future when the rubber really starts meeting the road and things become tough and maybe tempers run high and things like that. Having that shared team culture and the shared relationships are really important. Second thing to note is clearly defining roles and responsibilities, and that's obviously always a good practice, but more important than ever with your remote IT team, it's more difficult to identify when you might have misaligned expectations, when you don't see each other every day in person, you don't necessarily have a great sense for what working habits look like across your team. So really proactively setting expectations with everyone working on the project is going to help ensure that your team, your subject matter experts, your champions, your sponsors, everyone is starting from the same point, the same baseline understanding. And that also then allows you to step in and correct as needed in terms of what those expectations are. Third, remember that not everyone working on your project is necessarily coming from an IT background, and so they may not be super facile with technology. It's possible that even those on the IT team are coming from operations and don't have deep technology expertise. So the key takeaway here is make sure that everyone has access to your kind of baseline foundational file sharing, collaboration, messaging tools, etc., video conference apps, other things like that. But also make sure everyone has training. It might not be tools that they're used to using. They may not be used to sharing a document across many people at a time, things like that. And then finally, make sure that you've got a provisioning process. If a new stakeholder arises who you suddenly need to make sure they have video conferencing and make sure they're on your SharePoint or your team site or whatever, make sure you've got a provisioning process so they're not going to sit in a SailPoint queue or whatever your solution queue might be for 3-4 weeks and potentially become an unnecessary risk to the project that way. Finally, really make sure everyone understands how they're expected to work in the remote world. It comes back to expectation settings, but at its most basic, that might mean defining expected availability. I think another thorn in probably all of our sides is around email etiquette and email response times, and making sure that everyone has a shared understanding of how we're using email, when it's appropriate to pick up a phone call and answer a question finally without additional back and forth, how we use messaging apps, if at all. Just get everyone on a shared understanding so that you don't lose valuable productivity with missed emails and with folks not making phone calls when that would be the easy solution. And finally, last thing I'll mention here is really encouraging the use of video. I think is valuable. You want your team to be comfortable, but I think on the projects we've seen where we're pushing more, or the client is also pushing more towards video, I think it does make a difference in really building those relationships and getting to see your team members' face and your stakeholders' faces a few times a week to being able to really understand who they are and get more comfortable working with them in this environment that we're in now. Next topic I'll jump into here is stakeholder identification, or excuse me, stakeholder management in general as you're kicking off your project. So first, getting the right stakeholders involved is obviously crucial, and that engagement is going to be more difficult when you can't meet with your stakeholders face to face, when you can't meet them where they are and not necessarily on their time. So as always, you need to make sure it's the right people, and keep in mind that's not just about a stakeholder's title. It's about a lot of other important things like their reputation amongst their colleagues, their interest in change, and their interest in improving current state workflows. It's also about their availability, and that's probably one of the more important aspects right now, where it seems like everyone is super overloaded trying to deal with the ongoing pandemic and as well as operating in a virtual world. Next up, just as with your IT team, you need to be upfront about expectations with your stakeholders. So things like defining what the meeting load that you expect them to be calling to each week is going to look like, and defining what they're expected to do outside of meetings. What are you expecting to do with their colleagues in terms of evangelizing your project and answering questions and things like that. Additionally, in the virtual world, everyone seems to be on more calls than ever. So setting those standing project calls up well in advance and then planning around their busy schedules is key. Sometimes our vendor counterparts have trouble not seeing their project as the most important thing and not understanding why folks can't drop everything at 12 or 24 hours notice, but it's kind of part of our job is to help them manage that and make sure they're being respectful of our stakeholders' times. Then in terms of managing change, make sure you clearly explain why the project you're asking stakeholders to participate in is important. So how is it going to make their lives easier? How is it going to make patient lives better? Or how is it going to improve the standing of the health system? And I say you, but ideally that message is really coming from your project sponsor or other operational executive to clearly highlight the importance. And getting that message distilled to easily digestible talking points is important so that you or anyone on your team, a project manager, anyone can use that as they're kicking off meetings and as they're introducing the project to new stakeholders. Again, with the virtual world making things a little bit more tricky there to clearly communicate important aspects like that. Finally, making sure you build and push out the right communication tools to keep stakeholders engaged is really key early and virtually. So that's going to include proactive push tools like newsletters or potentially videos focused on some aspect of your project or the functionality that you're bringing live, as well as pull tools. So things like your intranet, your SharePoint, your Teams that stakeholders can access over the internet or wherever to get things like upcoming project events, project lexicon if there's a confusing terminology to the functionality you're implementing, upcoming meeting agendas, past meeting minutes, all kinds of things like that, so that folks can really self-serve on their time and make sure that they have the tools to proactively stay engaged available. Now, for any formal kickoff events, whether that's a demo, a workflow walkthrough, a project overview, a vendor meet and greet, whatever it might be, there are a couple of key things to keep in mind as well. So for planning purposes, most events are going to be a hybrid of virtual and in person. You'll hear me say this throughout the presentation, but since most of your stakeholders are likely in a clinical setting, it's helpful to coordinate a few large conference rooms where a few people at a time can congregate, obviously doing so in a safe manner and working with your your HR and compliance teams to make sure that that makes sense. But ultimately what that means is your logistics will cover both those in-person pieces and your virtual pieces. And you have to have someone really managing both those pieces, since it, unfortunately, it doesn't actually really reduce the work from what you'd be doing in an in-person world. Also, as part of planning, really focusing on streamlining your content, your decision points, and your participants as much as possible is going to be key. Complicated topics become even more complicated the more people you have in the mix, and I think that's even more true in a virtual world. So the more you can streamline that and keep things fairly focused, the better chance you have of having valuable sessions and really getting through everything you need to. Additionally, obviously presenting in a virtual world, especially to a large group and potentially with a large multidisciplinary team presenting, is an additional challenge. So make sure you have some dry runs, make sure that across your team or vendor teams, executives, whoever it is that's presenting, that you have the handoff process smooth. This might be the first exposure of your stakeholders, to your project. So you don't want to hurt the credibility of the project or the product with a flawed delivery. Then when presenting, obviously you need to make sure your technology works. So for any of those distributed call locations that you might have in conference rooms across campus or across locations, make sure someone's there to help set up the call and monitor if anything goes awry. But then really use technology to your advantage. So use your tools like the chat feature and timekeeping functionality to really keep sessions focused and on track. I think that's actually a way that some of these web meetings are potentially superior, is you can easily take those chats offline, collect that list of questions, address what makes sense to address in the session, but then have a easy written record of what else came up that you need to follow up on. And then finally, when you are following up after presentations, make sure you have a structure and a plan in place to disseminate your notes, likely recordings of the sessions, follow-up questions and answers, and then any other material that comes out of it, especially if you are really streamlining your participant list. That's great to get through it, but then you want to make sure that you have all that material available for others at the organization to see after the fact. So moving on to build and testing phases of your project, I'll talk a little bit about how to direct and monitor the core technical work of an IT project. And really the most important aspect of monitoring your project status is putting in place some processes around transparent and standardized tracking tools, reporting tools, and then escalation pathways, as well as connections into your governance structure. And the goal here is to make sure that everyone from an individual analyst to an IT executive can quickly and easily see and understand your current project status, see and understand project issues or risks that might affect me as an individual, and make sure that I have those things on my radar and understand what I need to be doing near term to help deal with those issues or risks. So ultimately, you want your build issue trackers, you want your status reports, you want your dashboards, your escalation and government all flow seamlessly together. So lower level trackers should give your PAX analyst a venue to record what his concerns are, what his issues are as they arise, to call out what he thinks the risk is, and if he has a mitigation plan to start to record it there. But then ultimately that should flow through a series of regularly scheduled reviews so that those issues can continue to be escalated as needed to make sure that they are resolved and that they're dealt with at the right area. So really what we're trying to show you in this diagram is we've got a toolbox of issues management tools. So everything from an issues, decisions, and risk log through your status reports and dashboards, but really those seamlessly integrate with your meeting cadence so that you can be reviewing those from your application team level through to your steering committee level on a regular basis. And that ensures that things get the attention they need, that nothing falls off the map. And I think while this isn't unique to a virtual world, being transparent and open about your project status and your issues and keeping everyone aligned is extra challenging without the benefit of drive-by conversations in the hallway and drop-ins to your office. So having this process very buttoned up is important, more important than ever really in the virtual world, to make sure that your project stays on track and that you have visibility to know whether it is or isn't on track from a leadership level. Now, one approach that we found works really well virtually during the course of application build out is to run structured build sprints. And the idea here is to essentially recreate the side-by-side build experience. If you've worked with Epic, for example, before, think about what happens when your AC and AM come spend time on site with your team. They might spend an hour or two in whiteboard design sessions, figuring out a tricky workflow, and then they might spend several hours really just kind of working shoulder by shoulder, working through difficult build, doing knowledge transfer to your team, really just crushing through the work they need to get done. So how we try to look at these is generally organized as a 4 or 5 day week with a semi-structured agenda for each day. And the idea is you want to ensure teams are coordinated, but you also want to allow customization and independence for individual team goals and needs. And you don't want to get it too structured where you're basically sitting on a structured call for 8 hours a day, because that's not actually the goal. The goal is that you're getting work done. So the week might start with a team kickoff to review the agenda and agree on goals for the week, as well as what your schedule looks like, and then be broken up into blocks of time focused on team time, focused on individual application build. Then you might have integrated team sessions scheduled throughout the week, as well as subject matter expert sessions focused on validation or design input or anything like that. And all interspersed with short stand-ups, maybe midday each day, to review any critical barriers anyone is encountering. And potentially you might want to have your credentialing or your help desk staff on those calls as well to help shut down any barriers that might be arising if there is anything around access or templates or anything like that might interfere with the team. And then a few last words on some best practices as you're managing the bulk of the project in the build and testing phases, really balancing, trying to complete all the ongoing work, managing your project plans and starting to prep for your go live that we'll talk about in a minute, and then handling new issues as they arise. So a couple of key things. One, communication. You really can't over communicate. I think, again, keep in mind that you're replacing all the things that would be informally communicated in person. So think of something like hanging up the project plan along the wall of a hallway or your team room. That's obviously not something you'll have in a virtual world, but you can replace that with something on SharePoint, something on Teams, or similar. You also won't have all those drop-in conversations. You won't have as much casual conversation of, hey, this is what I'm working on. This is what's going on in this integrated area. So looking at things like regularly recurring all teams and even all hands meetings. So maybe it's an all team meeting weekly and all hands meeting monthly. Looking at status reports, newsletters, regular messaging through the intranet, on the splash page, etc. That's really just going to let you make extra sure that everyone knows what's going on, everyone's on the same page. Another piece of this is potentially having a defined intake for questions. So like ask Epic at whatever your health system email is, so that folks can ask questions to say, hey, should I be involved in this upcoming event? Whatever happened to this follow-up from the question I asked 2 weeks ago, that kind of thing, just to give people that ability to reach out when they won't see you in the cafeteria, they won't see you in the parking lot or whatever, to ask those questions. Second, all the structure we talked about is important, but be prepared to pivot as needed. I think you can get the foundation in place, but make sure that you have open dialogue. What works, what doesn't work well, what do we need to tweak to make sure that we're moving in the right direction here? And then finally, recognize that there are going to be limitations of what you can and can't do virtually. So there are going to be some activities that you simply need to be on site for, and you should plan accordingly. So you might need to be looking at device inventory or infrastructure. You might need to be doing something where you need a better understanding of the layout, like of an ED, for example. And you might even have situations where you simply can't get what you need from your stakeholders, your end users virtually. We've certainly had experiences like that in projects in the last couple of months here, where for something like order set validation or med build validation, we weren't getting the time we needed, and so had to figure out how to get in the room with the stakeholders for a couple of hours and just crank through some work with them in a way that we were having trouble getting virtually. So plan for some of those on-site activities. Obviously, that's making sure your team's comfortable, scheduling it well in advance so that whoever you need to visit is comfortable with it, especially if you need to be in a clinical area, and then working with your HR and compliance departments to make sure that you're taking the right precautions as you send your team into some of those face-to-face interactions. So really in the lead up to go live now, we'll talk through training super users and go live support, as well as optimization. And each of these topics probably could be its own 30-minute webinar. So I'm going to try to hit on a few key things in each area. But again, it's not going to be super deep, and each of these could probably be a follow-up conversation that we're happy to have if anyone is interested. So when you start thinking about go live planning, a few of the top things to think about that will be impacted by the virtual world. First off, super users. So super user engagement is going to be as important as ever when you're virtual. If you think about it, they will likely be the only in-person support at the elbow during and immediately after go live. And we'll talk more about go live support, but just one key piece of kind of what they're going to play in this virtual world. So in the lead up to go live, obviously ensure your super users are identified. Again, make sure that they're the right people, make sure that they're fully bought in, and make sure that they understand the expectations, which are going to be obviously the additional training that you'd usually have your super users do in an in-person world. You're also likely going to need to train them on the supportive technology that you're planning on using at and post go live. So things like remote desktop that your IT staff might be using to help out and to troubleshoot will be good for your super users to know about. And then finally, ensure that they understand really what the meeting cadence and expectations at go live are, as well as beyond, and really try to draw that journey into optimization to make sure that the super user program doesn't stop at go live and after stabilization, that it continues on. And it's a valuable tool for you in IT and for your stakeholders post go live. Next, training. So as with the other areas I've mentioned, you'll likely be looking at a hybrid model. Again, double the logistics works. You have to figure out the in-person pieces as well as the virtual infrastructure. And again, working with HR and compliance to make sure the in-person pieces make sense and are set up safely, and figuring out what that means in terms of room capacity compared to room size, and all the pieces that go with those hybrid remote and in-person meetings and events. The final thing to mention on training is that virtual classes generally will benefit from being smaller and have a lower student to teacher ratio. So you can get 100 people on a webinar with a single trainer, but I don't think they're going to be trained very well if you do that. So really thinking that through and thinking through some of your ratios is important to do. But again, you can use technology to your benefit here. So think, for example, many video conferencing apps give you the ability to branch off smaller meetings from a main web meeting. So there's some ability there to have some of your trainers spend dedicated one-on-one time with an individual or with a small group while the majority of the class continues. Next up, go live readiness meetings, whether that's an epic GLRA, a day in the life walkthrough, a go, no go issues review. Again, similar issues with hybrid meetings. So keep your agenda and discussion streamlined, use technology to keep your agenda on track. And then finally, make sure that you're following up, you're using your communication infrastructure to push out important decision points, important takeaways across the organization after that event is complete. And then finally, command center planning. So finally, you need to really prepare in a different way for a virtual command center than you would for an in-person command center. You don't necessarily need to order the 24 carafes of coffee and the 3 buckets of Slim Jims, but you do need to be prepared for a fully virtualized model. So usually that'll mean a series of standing meetings throughout the day. You'll want to have open bridge lines potentially assigned per team or even per work stream or per area, and make sure that you're incorporating all of your relevant vendors and your internal team, so everyone really knows upfront what the plan is, how they're going to be accessing it. Your vendors might be organizing their own remote command centers out of their headquarters. So just make sure that everyone is aligned and that they know when to be dialed in and can really drive communication that way. And then the last few things to mention here. So end user support, obviously, as I mentioned, your super users will be a big piece of that, but also plan for on-demand virtual end user support. So having phone lines that your end users can call up for with really workflow questions. So it's not necessarily your help desk, it's really how do I do XYZ, not a break fix, but that does require dedicated technology. So it might be what you already have in place and potentially you're good. You might also have to push something out for new or further to if there are end users who might not have whatever your remote desktop or your screen sharing solution is in place currently. So something to think about to make sure that you can have at the elbow support, but virtually, and make sure that they can really support your end users that way. Next, all of this is going to rely on excellent issue reporting and management processes. So both in terms of how issues are reported and making sure that your super users especially understand what do they do to report issues, and if there are managers or anyone else that you want to have that access and that training as well, making sure that you're collecting good information from them. And then on the back end for your IT team, making sure that you're looking at those issues holistically and understanding not just what are the individual one-off break fixes, but also what are the overall root causes that we're identifying here as tickets come in one at a time, and making sure that you have the review processes in place to recognize those and potentially across teams. Next, and tying into that is you likely won't be able to get out on the floor, or not very often, and round to see how things are going and to hear in end users' own words what they're thinking and what their major issues are. So make sure that you have dedicated meetings set up for that. So with your super users, with your unit managers, et cetera. And that's another place where you can start to hear, okay, what are the macro issues that maybe we're missing in the forest for the trees of the issue tickets. So make sure you have that communication pathway in place. It also gives you a chance to say, yes, we know about this issue, we're working on it, here's our plan to deal with it. Finally, transitioning from stabilization to optimization, very important, and frankly, I think it's something that gets dropped in many implementations, even in the in-person world, but I think it's important upfront to have a plan to say, here's what stabilization looks like, but just as importantly, here's what optimization looks like, and here are the concrete events and the concrete plans that we are going to use to drive optimization. I've been on many projects where optimization as a word basically has to get dropped from vocabulary because it becomes meaningless, because end users hear so many times, oh, that's an optimization, that will hit that in optimization, and then this fabled optimization period never comes. So very important to say prior to the go live, hey, when we talk about optimization, this is what it is. We're going to have some dedicated sprints, some dedicated time where we'll be sitting with end users, understanding frustrations and concerns, and then fixing those concerns and communicating those back. It's also an opportunity for you to rely on your technology to communicate first the plans, and then really as you get into it to share the progress and to share what we're working on and what that's going to mean for end users, how it'll improve their system usage of the applications. So that pretty much took us through the project lifecycle. Just to wrap up here, a couple of key takeaways. Really, the project structure, your PMO tools, your communication tools are the most important foundation of your success in this virtual world. So having those defined early, making sure that they flow well, making sure that everyone knows about them and is seeing the outputs and the inputs is crucial to replace what you lose in in-person communication and what you lose in kind of your daily interactions from the face-to-face world. Second, technology is a key tool. I think that's pretty obvious, but make sure you're relying on it for your communication and for your project transparency. Make sure that that project plan that would be hanging on the wall is now somewhere online where I, as an analyst, can go look at it and understand what's coming and how my work fits into that. And as a stakeholder, I can look at it and understand, okay, this is what I need to be thinking about in the next 3-4 months. This is why I'm being asked the decisions I'm being asked today. And then finally, engagement takes hard work and a dedicated plan. So really put the work into it up front, more so than in the face-to-face world when you're virtual. Getting the time, helping people understand why it's important is more difficult and I think more crucial than ever. So all key things to think about, and that concludes the presentation, but we would love to hear any questions. I think you can chat them here, and we've got another 10 minutes here, so we've got a good amount of time to cover anything that might come in.
Thanks very much, Jeff. That was very informative. Very interesting presentation, so thank you very much. Again, if anybody has a question, if you want to type it into the questions area, I am happy to read those out loud for everybody to hear, and Jeff will be happy to answer those. I did have a few folks message me individually a question rather than put it into the main chat area. So, Jeff, I do have a couple of questions here that I'll throw at you while people are possibly putting in some other questions there. So you had talked about monitoring employee productivity. So this person was asking, what tools or applications would you possibly recommend to adequately monitor that employee productivity?
Okay. I think there might be a couple of things in there, and I think it can be a little bit of a slippery slope. So I know, there certainly are tools where you can say, who's actually logged in and working or checking email or whatever from 9 to 5 every day. That's not something I've ever really looked at, and it would rather not. I think there's some negative cultural impacts probably from that kind of monitoring, unless you're in an HR situation where you need to be looking at something like that for a certain individual. But I think from a productivity monitoring standpoint, I mean, a lot of it comes back to what I was talking about around build trackers and around issue monitoring tools, issue escalation tools, and making sure that those are in place so that as folks identify those things, as they identify areas that are off track, they can put them on there. And then you've got visibility into really what's going on across the project, what's going on across the team. If you want to look at individual kind of status reports of, this is what I as an analyst worked on this week, this is where I'm getting held up, this is what I plan to work on next week, that kind of thing. I think that's a good way to do it as well. And certainly time tracking also is another thing that might make sense, especially if you're more into a maintenance period, where it can be very helpful to see really what is the care and feeding of a live application take, and you can get that from project management tools, or potentially from your time tracking tools.
Interesting, thank you. So just as a personal follow-up, I'm curious to know then, so what if people aren't showing up for phone calls or video meetings that are scheduled for the team? How do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends a little bit on the acuity of the situation. If it happens once or twice, I think that's a manager to employee conversation to see what's going on here, and is there a technology or a tool issue or something going on in their personal life. But obviously, if it's a recurring issue, then you might be talking about performance improvement plans and pulling in your HR person to figure out if this person is actually able to meet the rigors and the demands of the job or not.
That makes sense. Let's see here. And I have one other question that was sent to me that was specifically asking a question about the build sprints that you had mentioned. Yeah. They were curious to know who would usually attend those.
Sure. Yeah. Usually, it'll vary based on the agenda, but generally it's obviously your full project team. So your analysts, your project managers, depending on how matrixed your team is, you might be pulling in people from like the business intelligence team, the reporting team. You'll almost certainly be pulling in people from your integration or your interface team. And then finally, you're likely, at least for parts of it, going to be pulling in some of your subject matter experts. And so really the important thing is having that kind of high level or roughly defined agenda. So you can say, hey, from 2 to 4 on Monday afternoon, we're going to be doing validation, and that means we need our oncology SMEs for protocols, and we need our pharmacy SMEs and our MD SMEs for order sets, et cetera, so that you get the right people involved without really needing to micromanage.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a question here from Sammy Othman, who asked, is Optimum currently involved in an implementation where the approach to support and training had to change in light of the pandemic? And if so, what did we do to adjust?
Yeah, absolutely. We have been and are, I would say, actively. So we had that go live back in May that I mentioned, where the training, both the training and the go live support were really pivots at the pretty last minute, as it was still, fairly, as of now, actually looks like fairly early in the pandemic. And Becky on our team, who heads up our training and activation team is better equipped to speak to this, but just high level, a big piece is re-scoping. So understanding that if we're supporting virtually, what does that mean in terms of resource needs, both for training and then for at the elbow support. And it's a little bit different of a methodology to come up with that number when you're in a virtual world. And then the second big piece is figuring out the technology and understanding what's in place already. We've certainly got some best practices and some tools at Optimum that we use, but working with the clients to understand what do they already have in place that we can use, and is that enough, or is there a gap there that we need to close, as well as still then managing the logistics of some folks being in person, as well as having the additional virtual pieces on top of that.
Great, thank you. And then I have one additional question I got here. It's asking, is the amount of staff needed and then the overall timeline of a project comparable from virtual versus on-site? Is there much difference between those?
That's a great question. I don't think so. The fly in the ointment obviously has been getting healthcare IT projects pushed forward over the last 4 or 5 months has been pretty difficult, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily because of the virtual nature. It's because everyone is focusing on 100 different things that they did not expect to be focusing on. So from an IT perspective, you've been standing up your telehealth solutions and pushing those out at scale in a way that you probably didn't plan to 8 months ago. And then obviously hospitals are dealing with surges and things of that nature. So I don't think it necessarily looks different. I think you have to plan a little bit differently. And I think, as I mentioned throughout the presentation, it takes a little bit more detailed planning. And it does take an intentional approach to say, when we're virtual, we do have to do things differently and to identify where those differences are to make sure that you have the right structure in place. But I don't think it inherently changes the length of the project or the number of people you need to engage.
Great, Jeff. Jeff, thank you very much for all your input and expertise today. No more questions have come in, so if nobody has anything else, we will conclude this webinar. Thank you very much for everybody attending. We will have the recording of this webinar up on our website at least by next week. And thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installment of the Optimum Healthcare IT webinar series. Have a great afternoon.